Welcome to the Rotary Club of Milwaukee. I am Club President Darren Miller, President and owner of JM Construction. As we gather virtually today, we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today, we have Angie Bernhardt, Director of Adoption Services, Inc., who will give our invocation today.
Thank you. As Rotarians, we are generally blessed with lives of opportunities unknown to many. Help us to review the register of our lives with honesty as we consider our priorities and our opportunity to help others. Open our hearts to those in need. Help us to share not only our tangible wealth, but also our intangible riches of knowledge, leadership, and creativity to make our city, nation, and world a better place filled with peace and love that you can bring through us.
Thanks, Angie. Now for a bit of club business. Last week, we welcomed City Development Commissioner Lafayette Crump to Rotary. Unfortunately, we didn't have any time for Q&A with the audience, but Lafayette did take the time to answer the questions that were in the chat at the end of the program. There is a link to his responses in this morning's email. If you missed the program, remember that all of our virtual programs are on our YouTube channel at the Rotary Club of Milwaukee. Speaking of last week, I also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Bob Gleason, our resident COVID-19 expert, for a thoughtful update on the COVID-19 situation. If you missed it, want to hear it again or share it, you can find the link to our website in this morning's email. A podcast version is also available. These months of the pandemic have been challenging for many of us at the Rotary Club of Milwaukee, and we've had to make a few accommodations. Some have been difficult, but we've been gratified to hear that many of our members tell us that they believe in Rotary now more than ever, a theme that you'll continue to hear from us. Now we'll hear from Sebastian May, Director of Marketing and Development at the Milwaukee Film.
It's important to maintain my Rotary membership now more than ever because Rotary is an organization that is dedicated to helping people in the community. It's apolitical in nature, and it does good things to help citizens. And I think that what could be more important than having something that unites us in a period of really strong division in this country. When COVID hit, my organization cut my own funding, like they were paying for my Rotary membership. because they saw the value in me connecting with other people in the community. And it occurred to me that this is a more important time than ever to renew my membership with my own money, because how else, what is more important than helping each other, especially in a time of division and in a time of a pandemic? Rotary is important now more than ever, I would say.
Special thanks to Sebastian for that message. We have a few social and volunteer events coming up. This Friday, November 20th, join us to sort food at Feeding America. Feeding America has instituted excellent COVID protocols, including limiting their volunteer hours to weekdays. This is a great way to roll up your sleeves with fellow Rotarians and make a difference in the community. As you've read, food bank services are in high demand right now. See the link in this morning's email to sign up. You may have also seen in our Friday email that Feeding America recently unveiled a new mural at their facility. Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin worked in collaboration with artists working in education to select local muralist Aisha Valentine to tell their story of solving hunger and unity in the local community. We have a few slides to show you some pictures and images of the mural. Well, we'll get you those pictures here shortly. The Rotary Club Milwaukee was instrumental in establishing Second Harvest in 1982, which became Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin. Rotarians Price Davis and Arthur Reamer worked with Dr. Milton J. Huber, a professor at UW Milwaukee, and other Rotarians to adopt a food bank project. Rotary is proud to be featured in this mural. There's also a link to a video of the mural in this morning's email. I'd like to say a special thank you to Rotarian Raina Andrews for including Mary and myself in that selection process. Check out that video. It's moving and very well done. This Thursday, our snack program will be a bit different. At 4:30 p.m., we will gather virtually with beverages of your choice, perhaps a wine, beer, or cocktail. And we'll be able to talk to fellow Rotarians to see what people are doing to stay entertained this winter. Book recommendations to movies, shows, outdoor gatherings, etc. Hope to see you all there. Finally, many of you may have seen that Hurricane Eta devastated many parts of Central America over the past 2 weeks. Guatemala has been hit extremely with strong winds and rain and has incurred significant flooding, mudslides, and destruction. Then Hurricane Lota struck last night, with rainfall accumulations estimated to be up to 16 inches, perhaps going as high as 20 to 30 inches in some areas. The Rotary Club of Milwaukee has sent $5,500 to our partners in Guatemala to assist with disaster relief efforts. This consists of $3,500 from the RCM Community Trust and $2,000 of direct contributions from our members. The needs are likely to grow, and we will keep you posted. Finally, if you're joining us via Zoom or YouTube today, please use the chat function to send us your questions. And now, it's my pleasure to have past President Dr. John Ridley to introduce our speaker today.
John, you're muted. You need to unmute. John, if you scroll your mouse across the screen, there should be a little microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you click on that, you should unmute yourself there. No, we still can't hear you, John.
What if we move to the presentation with Beth and then John? We'll do it a little backwards and we'll get John's remarks a little bit more toward the end, toward the Q&A. Does that sound okay to people? Okay. Sorry about that, John. I know we told you didn't have to do anything and look what happened.
Well, should I go ahead and get started?
Go ahead.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I can tell you my dad's introduction of me was going to be amazing. He was only going to have amazing things to say. So he'll tell you about it at the end. But anyways, so I'm Beth Ridley. I'm Dr. Ridley's one of his children, his favorite child, I guess I should say. And that was going to be in his introduction as well. But today we're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace, and just a little bit of background on this topic. So I know that this is a topic that a lot of companies have really been investing in for quite some time. There's ample evidence that shows building diverse and inclusive workplace cultures leads to better business outcomes, which we'll talk about. But I have to say, more recently, I see a lot of leaders and companies really, it has more of like a renewed interest in the topic of equity, diversity, inclusion, really since this summer in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And I've been seeing three trends of the clients who end up coming to me for help with building a sustainable culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion in their workplaces that I think are really interesting, that's leading to this renewed enthusiasm about this topic. So the first trend is that employees are really demanding that their companies and their leaders really take action around putting principles around diversity and inclusion into practice beyond just words and a statement. So there's a lot of leaders are motivated by their employees who are really demanding this. The second trend that I'm seeing is that companies are seeing that their clients and their customers have an expectation that the people that they're going to do business with are taking equity, diversity, and inclusion very seriously. So that's another motivating factor. And then the third one is, sadly, it feels like we are just so divided these days as a country. And a lot of those divisions that we experience outside of the workplace and our communities actually seep into the workplace. And so I have been getting a lot of calls lately saying things like, I would say at the summer, it was a lot of racial misunderstanding and racial tensions that were really seeping into the workplace. And more recently, it's been about politics. And so a lot of political tension is really spoiling the workplace culture. So these are three trends that I really haven't seen before that are sort of all coming together. That's really motivating leaders to be engaged in this space. And unfortunately, I think, all of our divisions and our differences are certainly not going away. So I think it's those leaders who really become expert at being able to bridge across differences and harness diversity for good versus having diversity be a source of tension are going to be the leaders that distinguish themselves as great leaders. I think leading with an inclusive mindset is in fact like the #1 leadership competency in 2020 and beyond. And companies that do that well are also going to distinguish themselves as great companies. So I know there's a lot of motivation and interest in this topic. I also know that sometimes there's a lot of uneasiness or even intimidation about this topic. I think a lot of leaders, while they like the principles around diversity, equity, inclusion, they're just not sure what they're supposed to do or what this means for them. I think also a lot of people are maybe a little nervous to engage in this space because, they just don't want to say the wrong thing and embarrass themselves. So unfortunately, I think sometimes we make this topic way too complicated and scarier than it needs to be. So my goal for our time together is to help to build your own confidence and comfort level around what it takes in order to bridge across differences and foster a culture of inclusion, and no matter what environment that you're in, and really sort of simplify and demystify diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you guys can see.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so objectives. Like I said, I'm going to introduce just some foundational concepts around diversity, equity, inclusion, and why they matter. I'll talk about what it takes to be one of those people who's really good at bridging across differences. And I'm going to leave you with some really super simple, easy things that you can do to put diversity, equity, inclusion principles into practice right away. So let's first start with some basic definitions. So the content that I'm going through, it's really just sort of like an appetizer portion of the content that I facilitate with companies. So in the interest of time, I won't be able to go too deep in any of these. And so in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about equity. I can save that at the end if there are specific questions about it, but I really wanted to just focus on diversity and inclusion for this presentation. And so simple definition, you can think of diversity as the mix, and inclusion is getting the mix to work well together. All right, so now let's break those down. So when we talk about diversity, I think it's really important that we have a very broad and an inclusive definition of diversity that includes all of the many dimensions that makes each person unique. So we tend to really focus on these primary dimensions of diversity, the visible ones that we can see, right? Whether that be race or gender. And we tend to neglect and overlook all of these invisible dimensions of diversity. And the chart that I'm showing here is just examples of some other dimensions of diversity. There's way too many to put on any one chart, but this just gives you a sense of, there are so many dimensions of diversity that make each of us unique. Now, I think that companies sort of immediately focus on just the visible dimensions of diversity at some risk. There's a couple of reasons why I think it's more important to have this broader, more inclusive lens when you talk about diversity. So the first reason is you tend to reduce, you don't want to reduce someone to just the visible dimensions of diversity that you can see, because then you minimize everything else that might make that person unique. And so I think, again, a lot of times companies say, well, we need diversity. We're just going to hire, like women and people of color. And then you bring them into the organization and you're not really appreciating everything about that person that makes them unique. So if you take me, for example, an African-American female, while my race and my gender are hugely important to me, they are also the least interesting things about me. And I think everybody can say that about themselves. People tend to focus on the things that they can see and they don't sort of embrace everything else that really makes someone unique. So that's one risk. The other risk is that I think a lot of times companies overlook the richness of diversity that's in their organization when it's not visible. And so, companies may look around and say, well, everybody looks the same. We don't have any diversity here, so nothing to do. And that's not true. There's a lot of diversity in terms of life experiences, leadership styles, personality traits, educational backgrounds and skills that often go sort of untapped and unharnessed in organizations. So I like to tell companies, rather than jump to the solution of let's just hire more people who don't look like us, I say start practicing that muscle of inclusion with the diversity that you have to get good at it. So then when you bring in someone who has a dimension of diversity that is very different and makes a difference, they're stepping into an inclusive environment. And so if you do things like, if you work with if you work with your colleagues to maybe understand, personality traits or leadership styles and have conversations, are we really creating an environment where people with different leadership style orientations feel valued and embraced? That same muscle that you do to build a sense of inclusion around that invisible dimension of diversity is the exact same muscle that you use to build bridges across dimensions of diversity that may make more of a difference. And then the third reason why I think it's important to have a broad definition of diversity is that it enables everyone to see how contributing to the work of creating a culture of inclusion is beneficial to them. So I think everyone, if you look at some dimension of diversity that, makes up, who you are, we've all had the experience of feeling left out or marginalized or, somehow treated differently because of that dimension of diversity. And if you ask people to just sort of reflect on what that feels like, more people are likely to engage and say, yes, this work is worthwhile investing in because I can see how it benefits everybody. And the risk of not doing that means that often this work falls on the shoulder of women and people of color only, which is exhausting, and it's also not very inclusive. So that's, I think, the first concept to keep in mind. So then next is the concept of inclusion, right? So getting the mix to work well together. Now, inclusion is not a direct result of having a diverse environment. You got to really work at inclusion. Oftentimes there'll be diversity but not inclusion, and that's what leads to discord and dysfunction. So the outcome, or the desired outcome of inclusion, is the sense of belonging. And belonging means you feel truly valued and accepted and supported and appreciated. And the best way to maybe appreciate what belonging is to understand what it isn't. So this pictures kind of like a spectrum of the range around the topic of inclusion. And at the end of the spectrum is exclusion. That's like the opposite of what we're going for with belonging. And we all can relate to the feeling of being left out. That's exclusion. Now the challenge is a lot of companies sort of fall within and stay in this tolerance area. And tolerance is really the willingness to put up with something that you may not agree with or like. And a lot of companies think tolerance is good. We're going to tolerate the differences that we have, focus more on the commonalities and minimize the differences. Now the challenge with that is I think we can all relate to what it feels like to be tolerated, merely tolerated, versus a full sense of belonging. And I think the challenge with being just tolerated is that it forces people to sort of minimize a dimension of diversity of themselves to fit in with the broader community or the prevailing culture. And that's actually a phenomenon called masking. And so research shows that up to 60% of employees will mask or hide an aspect of themselves so they can fit in with the broader culture. And what ends up happening with that is you get more of a culture of sameness or too much commonality. And an indication of where you may be stuck in the tolerance space versus having people really feel like they belong is if you have a situation where people don't really speak up in meetings, maybe because they're afraid or they don't feel like their opinions are going to be truly embraced or valued, or a situation where people wait for the most senior person in the room to speak up. That would be an indication that you really don't have a sense of belonging in your culture. You're sort of stuck in that tolerance phase. And then, of course, with effort and work and simple strategies, the goal is to get everyone to feel like they can fully bring all their dimensions of diversity into the workplace and they feel valued, respected, and appreciated. All right, so those are the main definitions. Now, the nice benefit of being able to have both diversity and inclusion in the workplace is that there's a lot of business benefits to that. So research shows that diverse and inclusive organizations really do have better business outcomes. And I think we can all appreciate how that happens just intuitively, right? So if you have a sense of belonging in your culture and people feel comfortable and confident speaking up, you're going to get more perspectives to look at a challenge or a problem or an opportunity. And when you have more perspectives looking at something, you get more creativity, more innovation, basically better decision making. And better decision making always leads to better outcomes, which will lead to better business performance. And then, everybody wants to work for a company that's doing well and a company where they feel that they can really bring their full selves to work. And so that also makes recruiting and retaining talent, and especially talent that brings a lot of diversity into the workforce, a lot easier. So you can see how having both diversity and inclusion actually creates this virtuous cycle within workplaces. Okay, so I like to say diversity and inclusion together. It's good for the soul. Everybody wants to feel like they belong, and it's really good for business, as the research shows. So why is it kind of challenging to get there? And so one of the biggest barriers to creating a culture of inclusion is our own implicit bias that we all have. So implicit bias, or otherwise called unconscious bias, are really the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our views, our actions, and our decision-making in unconscious ways. So now, we all have biases. That doesn't make anyone good or bad. It actually makes us all human. Because biases is the result of how our brains naturally work. So our brains are processing up to 11 million bits of information per second. However, our brains can actually only consciously process up to 40 bits of information at a time. So that means our brains are really working overtime unconsciously without us even knowing it. And it's a way for our brains to sort of speed up our thinking process, speed up our response by taking shortcuts with helping us process information. And so those shortcuts are, we will see information, bring it in, we'll quickly categorize it and ascribe meaning to it based on whatever data it can draw upon. So a simple example would be, if I see a dog, my brain unconsciously will bucket it as an animal, that's the category. And then based on my past experience with the dog, my brain will say friendly or maybe not friendly. So for me, for example, I grew up with a dog. It was cute and cuddly, named Frisbee. And so when I see, miniature schnauzers, I immediately categorize friendly dog. My husband, on the other hand, was bit by a dog growing up. So his brain unconsciously see a dog, categorize it as animal, but ascribe perhaps dangerous to it. And so you can see why our brains, while it's doing us a favor by helping us process information unconsciously, it also leads fertile ground for fermenting beliefs that are not truly based on known facts. So we all know not all dogs are good and not all dogs are dangerous. But that's really sort of the impact of implicit bias. And so therefore we all have it because we all ascribe meaning based on information that we can pull from our own life experiences, from messages that we might get, as we're growing up, through conversations, and certainly through television, movies, and media. All that information just seeps into our subconscious, and it sort of lands with us as implicit bias. None of us are immune from this. So I gave you an example of how implicit bias plays out with animals. But let's talk about how it plays out with humans in the workplace. So there are lots of examples of how implicit bias impacts our daily actions and decisions. But here's two very common examples that end up showing themselves in the workplace. So an end result of implicit bias, one end result is affinity bias. And so affinity bias means that when you find something that you share in common with another person, you immediately ascribe more favorable, positive attributes to that person overall. So an example would be, if I'm interviewing someone in an interview and I find out that that candidate and I went to the same college, I might say, oh, I went to that college, that person went there, he or she must be pretty awesome. And I might think of that person more favorably, and they could rise to the top of the list for being hired. Now, just because you have something in common shouldn't mean that someone's not hired. It means that that shouldn't be the primary reason why they're hired. So a lot of times affinity bias in the workplace means that we end up mistaking comfort with someone for competence, that they may not fully have competence. Another example that's really common with our implicit bias at play is confirmation bias. And that's when we take actions to reinforce beliefs that we already have. This is very common because we all want to be right. So we will seek out information to confirm what we believe we already know. And I think, unfortunately, the internet and news media is really helping to double down on confirmation bias that we have. So these are examples of how they play out in the workplace. And the thing is, implicit bias is really insidious because we don't know that it's happening, and it influences every single action and decision. So you can see how, for example, over the course of someone's career, implicit bias really impacts that. So if you think of someone is making a decision on, the language to use in posting for a job, they're making a decision where implicit bias is influencing where they post for that job, what the interview is like, what the interview questions are like, who gets hired, what growth and development looks like, and promotion decisions. So at the end of the day, that all adds up to a compounding impact on every individual, every company, and even every industry and globally. So evidence of this are a couple of facts, right? So we know that only 10% of Fortune 100 companies have a female CEO, but women make up 50% of the workforce. That is reflective of the compounding impact of implicit bias. So also, only 3% of senior level managers and executives are Black, but yet Black people make up 10% of the annual population who graduates from college. So, these are examples of the compounding impact of implicit bias. All right, so lots of other reasons why it might be hard to create a culture of inclusion, but implicit bias is a main one. So now the question is, what gets to better? And so the main thing that helps to bridge between diversity and inclusion to create a sense of belonging is for people to lead with an inclusive mindset. So an inclusive mindset is basically that ability to bridge across differences, recognize and value differences to create a sense of belonging. And I think a lot of companies, when they think of, well, we want to create a culture of inclusion, they'll immediately go to programs and policies. But I say the very first step you should do is to really foster an inclusive mindset as a leadership competency, especially among leaders, because leaders really set the tone for the rest of the organization. And so the good thing is that focusing on mindset is super, super impactful, but it's also free to do. So great for companies that don't have a lot of budget, and small acts done consistently really, really, really make a difference in terms of building this inclusive mindset. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those strategies are to have an inclusive mindset. So bottom line, to me, it requires really two things. It really means that if you are going to be good at bridging across differences, you have to find a way to bring more awareness to your implicit biases, as well as minimize them so they don't too much impact your decision making. So in order to do that, you need courage and curiosity. The courage part starts with first being honest with yourself around what implicit biases you may have. And a really good way to start is just reflecting on your social circles. How do you move throughout the day, and what diversity are you exposed to or interact with, or what diversity are you not exposed to? Think about who you choose to spend your time with. Who would you have over for dinner? Pre-COVID, when we could have people over for dinner. But more importantly, ask yourself, who do you not have over for dinner? So where you have missing gaps in diversity could be an indication where you have implicit biases because you just have limited experience. So you're drawing on not a lot of data to inform your decision making. So that's courage number one. Courage number two then is to put yourself in situations where you have the opportunity to engage with people who are different than you. Because what you want to do is start to minimize and replace your biases and stereotypes with more empathy and understanding. And the only way to do that is to increase your data points around the human experience by engaging with humans. So I don't think that you can read about differences or watch a movie or go to a museum. That helps, but it's really about engaging with people and seeing how the world is from somebody else's eyes, especially since there's so many dimensions of diversity that make us all up. You can really only appreciate the complexity of diversity by meeting with people and understanding experiences that are different than yours. All right, so that's usually where I lose a lot of people, because they're like, well, wait, I don't want to talk to people who are different than me. That's a natural human tendency. We gravitate towards people who are similar to us, and we don't, want to spend too much time with people who are different than us. But I'm going to give you some simple strategies so you can muster your courage and your confidence to do it without feeling totally awkward. So the first thing is, before having a conversation with someone, to bridge across differences, to learn about their lived experience that's different than yours, to broaden your own perspective, to minimize your own implicit bias. The mindset that you have going into these conversations with someone who's different than you will really make the difference. So 3 key tips for what you should do to have a conversation so you can learn and grow from someone else's experience. So tip number 1 is, this is where the curiosity comes in. Engage with genuine curiosity. So you are initiating a conversation so that you can learn, not to prove a point or to get your own personal opinion across. Tip number 2, make sure you listen and seek to understand, not to agree. It is okay to not agree. Make sure you're listening and assume you can always learn, even when you don't agree. This one is kind of hard to do, because I think a lot of people are conditioned that every time you open your mouth, it's to get people to agree with you. So you got to sort of work on this one. And the third one is, believe what you hear from someone. I think a lot of times, if we don't have the same shared experience as someone, we just assume that, it can't be true. So really challenge yourself to assume someone is telling the truth from their perspective and believe them. And so that's sort of the mindset that you want to go into a conversation. Now, the hard part is actually initiating a conversation so you can learn about differences from someone who's different than you. And so I'm going to give you 3 foolproof phrases to use so you can initiate a conversation about differences without feeling totally awkward. So here are the 3 phrases. You can initiate a conversation by simply saying, I'm curious to know. That is a great way of being able to ask somebody something without any type of judgment. Then just say, tell me more. This gives somebody the opportunity to share more about the topic that you engage them in. And then say, thanks for sharing. Acknowledge that someone was maybe vulnerable, talking about themselves, and ideally you'll reciprocate as well. It just so happened that I was in a Zoom meeting recently, and someone actually asked me a question using I'm curious to know, and it went over really well. So she had asked me, I'm curious to know, do you prefer to be called African American or Black? She really didn't know, what is the terminology that she should use? And I love how she said it. I think she just sort of did it intuitively, because it was sort of like a graceful way of asking what could be an awkward question. So the conversation led to a lot of really good conversation. The only one other thing I would add to that is ask someone to answer your question from their own personal experience. Don't ask someone to speak on behalf of whatever community they're a part of. So, she could ask, Beth, do you prefer the term, or what term do you prefer to talk, to indicate your race, as opposed to, what do Black people want to be called? All right, so the last thing I want to leave you with before we get open up for Q&A is, a call to action, right? So hopefully you guys have embraced these tips. They're not too hard. Like I said, it just requires a little bit of courage to be honest about your implicit bias, to put yourself in situations where you'll meet people who are different, which, by the way, usually that means work or organizations like Rotary. Usually it's these types of organizations or venues where we are exposed to diversity that we don't actually have in our personal lives. So tap into that to challenge yourself to engage in a conversation with someone about difference. And because I know political differences is a hot topic that people are calling me about, we can all do our part by challenging ourselves to have a conversation with someone who voted differently than you. And again, seek to understand and replace your biases about what you think about someone who doesn't vote the same way you do with more information. And so to give you, one last thing to give you courage to do that is always think about what could go right when taking the initiative versus what can go wrong. So think about, the opportunity cost of not having the conversation. You might have missed out on deepening a relationship with someone. Also, at the end of the day, you're broadening your own perspective. That's going to make you smarter. It's going to lead to better decision making. It'll make you more interesting. And then you're also developing this skill set, like I said, that's going to be so in demand, that ability, be that person who can bridge across differences really, really well. I think that, again, is like the #1 leadership competency. So my call to action for all of you, maybe before the next Rotary meeting, reach out to someone. It doesn't have to be about politics, but I just think it's a timely topic, and have a conversation. Now, before I end, I do want to end on this, a final thought, because I know a lot of people are probably thinking, well, that's nice. Are we really going to solve all the world's problems, make a better world just by bridging differences through dialogue? So if you're kind of thinking that that's a Pollyanna-ish attitude, I want you to consider South Africa. Now, I lived in South Africa for 2 years, right at the end of apartheid. And so I had the unique position of observing a country transition from completely divided under apartheid to integrated democracy. And one of the things that really made the difference in that transition was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And basically the whole premise was, through people sharing their stories about life under apartheid, no matter what side you are on, you can find commonality in the human experience around suffering and loss. And so people who were perpetrators of crime under apartheid and victims of crime under apartheid came forward to tell their stories. Sometimes they came together to tell their stories. And these hearings were held all over the country at community centers and churches, and they were aired on TV every Sunday night. So, for quite a period of time, the whole nation was watching and hearing these stories and connecting to one another on more of a human level of just the human experience living under such a horrible regime. And so I think that went a really, really, really long way. Again, that dialogue, that storytelling, that connecting with people on a human level and being able to bridge across differences went a long way to heal the country. So I think that, if it can have such an impact, if dialogue across differences can impact a country like South Africa that was completely divided, at a minimum, it can make your workplace better. I mean, it can do no harm, I'll put it like that. It can only make the workplace better. And I think we also have an opportunity to even make the country better, one conversation at a time. So that's what I want to leave you with. And so Mary, I guess I can turn it over to you.
Yes. Well, thank you, Beth. As I said before the meeting, I always leave every conversation I have with you feeling inspired and energized. And today is no different. So thank you. And for some reason, I'm having trouble pulling up the chat. Here we go. But all right, I just have to ask this question to begin with. And I'm curious to know, Beth, even though it's probably the least interesting thing about you, do you prefer to be described as African American or Black?
Oh, that's interesting. I go back and forth. I sort of use Black more casually. To me, it's more of a casual term. I tend to use maybe African American more in workplace settings. But I am fine with either. And it's funny, so when that person asked me that question, I actually went home and asked the question with my family members. We're a family of 5, so 4 additional people. I got 4 different answers. So that's why it's important to ask the question from somebody's own perspective.
That's right. So be curious. So Alex Chu says, great presentation. Question, isn't trying to get diversity and inclusion education at the corporate level pretty late for most people? Shouldn't it start in grade school and high school and in our home, right? That's right.
Yeah, I agree. But yes, I definitely agree. And I think it is actually starting more in grade school. I feel like, sort of like those trends that I talked about, people were truly really motivated and are really waking up that it's just, we have to bridge across these differences, because I think the trajectory that we're on is just like unsustainable with hyper division. So I do think that trend is happening. But the truth of the matter is, again, a lot of times, the workplace for us is the most diverse place, and companies are motivated because it is good for business. So I think a lot of that education is happening in the workplace, and especially when people sort of embrace and realize that building an inclusive mindset as a leadership competency, it makes you a better leader. But then it also makes you a better parent and a better friend and a better community member. So I say education should happen at multiple levels over the course of one's lifetime, because this work, they always say it's a journey, and it's true. There's too many dimensions of diversity. No one's going to master them all. But the more you practice having conversations and bridging across differences, like anything that you learn new, it just becomes easier. And then it just sort of becomes just the way that you operate.
I'm going to ask you a related question here from Chris Hendricks. And she said, in my experience is that informal workplace interactions and networking, internal and external, often serve to break down barriers. With our current work from home situation, what suggestions do you have to overcome this?
Yeah, so I think there's simple things that everyone can do to contribute to foster more of a sense of belonging. I like to suggest maybe doing, virtual coffee with people and talk about anything but work. So that's a thing. I think there's a lot of like really fun virtual experiences that you can do. Experiencing new things together is a great way to learn and grow. And when you do it collectively with other people, it's also a great bonding experience. So for example, our family just did an Airbnb virtual experience together. And it was like a magic show, and you can go online and a magician shows up and you have fun together. It's an alternative to a team building experience that you can do virtually. So I think with a little bit of creativity, and quite frankly, sometimes it's really super small things. Like, I think it's just kind of like also just slowing down and pausing and asking someone a question and listening to the answer. We tend to get in execution mode and kind of overlook, just simple things that we can do to create more human connection that leads to a sense of belonging. And I think also ask more creative questions than just, how are you? You might want to ask somebody, what are you excited about today? Or are you learning anything new? And listen to the answer. And those are really simple, small things to start to create a sense of belonging in the workplace. And again, don't minimize that. These small things, if done consistently, really, really can shift the culture.
And Beth, I think if I ask you to stop screen sharing, then I think we can see, people who are on the call, look at the gallery view and give everybody a sense of belonging. That's really one of our goals in Rotary, is for people to feel like to make everyone have a sense of belonging. So thank you for doing that. And Keith Butler says, do you think political correctness helps or hurts the conversation? Here's an easy question for you, Beth.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't get to sort of a deeper understanding. So I think, the goal should be, I like to say, if you broach someone around a dimension of diversity that makes a difference and it's awkward and uncomfortable, your goal is not to resolve everything in the first conversation, but to try to keep the door open for a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth conversation. That's where the relationship building and the understanding happens. So I think sometimes political correctness, it helps us to be in that tolerant mode to kind of get along without offending people. But you still have to take that extra step. If there's something that's on your mind that you just don't get, like why about this person? There's something about, I don't understand. Then I would then set up time with the person, use my communication cues, and say, open the door for a more meaningful conversation.
Karen Hung asks, Beth, appreciate your comment about reaching across the political aisles to bridge understanding and curiosity. Given a perceptually high division across our culture, what are you encouraged to see broadly and specifically? Any glimmers of light out there for us, Beth?
Well, I think that to me, the glimmer of light is that, companies are prioritizing this for all the reasons that I described. And in terms of the political divide, voters are employees too. And so while they may not be motivated to bridge the political divide in their own time, there is opportunity, I think, to do it at work. And then also to deepen relationships with colleagues, develop that muscle, that leadership skill set, and contribute to a better environment. So I kind of hope that companies, and if all of you are leaders in your company, you will encourage your employees to do it. And the nice thing about politics, I think, is that it has a lot of intersectionality, right? I think when the conversation is just about race or gender, that tends to be somewhat limited, or not everybody sees themselves in that. But politics includes race and gender and where you grew up and life experiences and personality, a lot of things, geographic diversity. So I'm encouraged that companies are taking this seriously, and many of us work in companies that are taking this seriously. And so that provides a platform or an opportunity. And the same thing with, people join organizations like Rotary because they at least have some curiosity to interact with people who are different. Now you're just armed with some tools to be able to take a little bit more action on that.
Thank you. And Jeff Martinka says, thank you, Beth, for offering disarming examples. It's often hard to know how to start a difficult conversation, and you offered the tools. And yes, and Teresa Regan said, I've heard that diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. And Chris Holmes said, and yes, and equity is being asked to help plan the party.
Yeah, they're great. Yes. Hear, hear.
Good. And I'm going through the chat here, but if somebody wants to raise their hand too, we just have a couple of minutes left here. I'm sure that we could have a little bit of a dialogue here going here at the end. John Hine here.
Isn't one's view of what is politically correct an example of implicit bias?
Yes, I think so.
So when you're trying to talk to people, whatever you're calling politically correct is what you have in the back that is going to make you accept or reject, or what you have to worry about.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I would agree with that.
Jackie heard Barbara saying, is Dr. Ridley going to post-introduce Beth? And he actually sent a message that he was not going to do that, but if his computer is working, we certainly would love to hear from him. But he's kind of shy sometimes, So.
He'll say that I'm his favorite child.
Sorry.
We just have to talk Rotary.
And Tom Gale says, nice job, Beth. Would you say that being attractive is an advantage in the corporate workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that is, again, how our bias at play. I think when it's called the halo effect, right? So if we see something that we like about someone, we then assume or ascribe more positive impressions of them overall, right? If you like what someone is wearing, you're going to assume that they're like a really good speaker. And so again, for whatever reason of why you might, think someone's outward appearance, again, it's that unconscious, we don't even quite know or not even aware of what we do it, but there's so many things that can trigger our biases. And again, it's all based on our own personal experiences or limitations of our own personal experience.
I have a question, if I could, Mary.
Oh, Steve, please go ahead.
Beth, in a smaller company, if you're trying to be intentional and recruit at a higher level to create more diversity, I think we all agree it's important what the top looks like versus the general employment. So how do you recruit in a small company where, history and relationships are such an important thing? but now, you know, you want to bring somebody in at a higher level, but you don't really know them.
Yeah, so I think like my answer to that is just probably also just general recruiting best practices. And usually the best talent that you find are through referrals of your personal network, for example. And so I always encourage companies to really, you know, challenge everyone in the company to broaden and diversify your own personal network, because then you broaden the pool of really good diverse talent that you may not already have. I always say, why limit your search to just the people who apply to your posting for a job? Now, that does take longer. You can't flip the switch and all of a sudden your network is diversified, but there's no better time to start than now. And I always think it's kind of interesting to me, it kind of tickles me. People are like, we just can't find, great Black talent. And I say, I know so many, but my network is, I know a lot of African Americans, but imagine if every person in your organization just took the time to cultivate and diversify their own personal networks. You sort of then multiply your ability to identify and attract those people who would be a good match for what you're looking for, but also bring in some dimensions of diversity that you don't have. So there's no easy solution to that, but it absolutely can be done. It's all about broadening your network.
Well, Beth, thank you. Thank you for belonging to Rotary. And I think that hopefully everyone here has a sense of belonging to Rotary and cares deeply about Rotary. But also, you really gave us a very thoughtful and inspiring and energetic presentation. And that's not easy to do on Zoom. So you really knocked it out of the ballpark. So thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to President Darren.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks also, Beth, for being here. I really love how joyfully you approach your work. As you may know, in honor of leaders like you, Beth, who speak to our club members, we'll be making a donation to the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin, whose mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Some quick news about another volunteer opportunity that we have coming up. It's also time to sign up for the annual bell ringing for the Salvation Army. On Saturday, December 5th, from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., you and your family can ring bells at two Metro Market locations. The first at 1123 Van Buren and the other at 4075 North Oakland Avenue. See the link in this morning's email to sign up and sign up for one of those hour-long shifts. Also, don't forget to check out the weekly survey email coming out after the program today with info about volunteering at Feeding America this Friday. Join us next Tuesday, November 24th, to hear from Tony Thrasher, Medical Director of Crisis Services at the Milwaukee County Behavioral Health Division, who will talk to us about mental health, suicide, and changes in coping during this historic pandemic. I appreciate all of you being here today.